East African history, the rise of nationalism in East Africa. The rise of nationalism in East Africa. Nationalism is the desire by a given group to achieve political, economic and social independence. It is also defined as the increased love for one's nation. Nationalism was characterized by formation of political parties and mass political awareness. Factors that contributed to the rise of nationalism in East Africa. World War I and II led to the rise of nationalism in East Africa because it encouraged Africans to form nationalistic movements like Mama in Kenya. The high levels of unemployment and poverty made Africans to form mass political movements, like Mama, to demand for better conditions. The influence of Christian missionaries who always stressed equality of all men before God also encouraged Africans to rise up and fight for their rights. Missionary education produced elites like Jomo Kenyatta, Apollo Milton Obote and Julius Nyerere, who led the independence struggles. The emergence of an educated class of Africans also speeded up the independence struggles, because these educated Africans provided the leadership e.g. Jomo Kenyatta, Julius Nyerere. The granting of independence to Asian countries like India and Pakistan in 1947 aroused nationalistic feelings among the East Africans, since they also felt that they should be independent. The development of national languages like Swahili for Tanganyika and English for Uganda and Kenya created unity among Africans, and it solved the language problem. The spread of socialism and communism by USSR and China also led to the rise of nationalism in East Africa because these countries were supporters of anti-colonialism. The emergence of new superpowers like USA and Russia after World War I also led to the rise of nationalism because they always stressed colonization of African countries. The growth of Pan-Africanism also led to the rise of nationalism, e.g. they brought the notion of Africa for Africans, which created unity amongst the Africans. The 1941 Atlantic Charter, published by President Roosevelt USA and Premier Churchill of Britain, called for people to form their own governments under which to live. The formation of cooperative movements also led to the rise of nationalism. They became a East African history, the rise of nationalism in East Africa. Increased urbanization forced many people to migrate from villages to towns, which exposed these people to new ideas of liberty and equality, which forced to form political parties. Support from Africans in diaspora, blacks who were living abroad in USA, England. These gave support to fellow Africans at home to rise against European rule. The influence of the 1952 Egyptian Revolution. This revolution was spearheaded by Colonel Nasser, and he influenced nationalists by giving support to movements like Mama. The formation of the United Nations in 1945 also led to the rise of nationalism in East Africa. The organization had an anti-imperialism policy and encouraged Africans to rise against European rule. Problems faced by early nationalists. Tribal differences greatly affected the independence struggles. E.g. in Uganda, the Baganda didn't want to unite with other tribes, while in Kenya, Kony was accused of being a Kikuyu. Tribal grouping differences in political ideologies also affected the work of early nationalists. E.g. in Kenya, Kony favoured a unitary community while Koju wanted a federal government. Differences on how to achieve independence also affected the work of early nationalists. E.g. in Kenya, the Mama people preferred violence and others peaceful means. Lack of a uniform language also affected the work of early nationalists. E.g. in Uganda, although people hated Uganda because of the already elevated position of Uganda. The death of leaders of nationalistic movement, e.g. General China in Kenya. This created a lot of fear among the local people, and it created a leadership vacuum. Religious differences also affected the nationalist struggles. These were created by the missionaries, and they made it hard for people to unite. The inferiority complex among Africans also affected them. Many of them underrated themselves and thought that they couldn't defeat the white man. Lack of funds also hampered the work of the nationalists, e.g. they could not have all the supplies needed like guns and ammunitions. Some Africans collaborated with the colonialists, and these weakened the nationalists, i.e. they saw no need of fighting the whites. There was a problem of foreign interference, e.g. in Kenya, the Mama was crushed by a East African history, the rise of nationalism in East Africa. The nationalists in Kenya and Uganda mainly concentrated in urban areas and denied themselves support from the majority rural population. British policy of divide and rule also undermined the work of the nationalists. It created tribal thinking among tribes, and this affected the unity. There were also clashes between the different leaders of the various nationalistic movements, and these wrangles reduced on their effectiveness. Lack of proper organization and planning also affected the work of nationalists, e.g. the Mau didn't have a clear plan of attack against the British. Political parties in East Africa. A political party is an association of persons whose major aim is to acquire state power. In East Africa, parties formed included Kenya African National Union (KONU), Kenya African Democratic Union Kodu, Tanganyika African National Union Tonu, Democratic Party DP, Uganda National Congress UNC, and Uganda People's Congress UPC. Most of these parties were formed and dominated by educated Africans. Why were political parties formed? They were formed to fight for the independence of their respective countries. They were also formed to demand greater African representation on the Legislative Council. Political parties wanted the extension of the voting franchise to the Africans since they had been denied the right to vote. The rise of Pan-Africanism also drove Africans to form political parties because they wanted to rule themselves. Political parties were also formed as a result of colonial rule and its evils like loss of land, forced labour, heavy taxation. They were also formed to fight against European exploitation of African resources like land, labour and minerals. The influence of the Second World War was also a factor in the formation of political parties, as Africans who had fought in the war came back with their zeal to liberate fellow Africans. Political parties were formed to fight for the release of imprisoned political prisoners like Kony, was partly formed to fight for the release of MC Jomo Kenyatta. East African history, the rise of nationalism in East Africa. The rise of African nationalism was also manifested shown through the formation of mass political parties. Political parties were also formed to fight the discriminatory tendencies of the whites, e.g. in education, health and employment. Political parties were also formed to demand for the removal of restrictions on the cultivation of cash crops, trade and free movement. The role/achievements of political parties. They contributed to the achievement of independence in their respective countries. Political parties fostered unity and brought different people and tribes together. They contributed to the freeing of political prisoners like Jomo Kenyatta by Kony. They enlightened and educated the masses about their rights in their respective countries. Through boycotts, demonstrations and riots, they advocated for the participation of Africans in the voting process. They advocated for the equality of all races and the establishment of multiracial governments. They acted as platforms for explaining the colonial ills to the people, especially in local languages that were understood by everyone. Political parties contributed greatly to the development of infrastructure like roads, schools, and hospitals. As a result of their pressure, Africans were able to get white-collar jobs. They contributed to the development of agriculture like the establishment of Pusetma Agricultural College and Kabimba Rice Scheme in Uganda. They contributed to the attainment of republican status by the East African states, e.g. Uganda, in 1963 and Kenya in 1965. They led to the establishment of adult suffrage in East Africa. Problems faced by the political parties. Tribal differences led to disunity which delayed independence, e.g. DP for Baganda and UPC for Northerners. Differences in political ideologies also led to power struggles, e.g. UPC could not have the same plan with DP on how to achieve independence. Differences in languages created the problem of language barrier, i.e. Uganda lacked a national. East African history, the rise of nationalism in East Africa. Imprisonment of charismatic national leaders created power vacuum at the top. Differences on how to achieve independence, e.g. some wanted force and some wanted diplomacy. Inferiority complex of Africans, i.e. they underrated their potential to fight the whites. Lack of funds to sustain their programs made it difficult to spread awareness among the masses. Foreign interferences, e.g. political parties were always not allowed to freely carry out their work. Some Africans collaborated with colonialists which weakened the work of political parties. High level of illiteracy made it very difficult for the leaders to convince the local people. Poor transport and communication to effectively spread ideas countrywide. Lack of proper organization made it difficult to achieve independence quickly. Nationalists mainly concentrated in urban areas and neglected the majority rural population. British policy of divide and rule worsened the levels of tribalism and created tribal thinking. The few educated Ugandans were comfortably employed in the GovT civil service and could not join the independence struggles. The road to independence in East Africa. Tanganyika. On 9 December 1961, Tanganyika became the first East African state to achieve independence. It was steered to independence through the efforts of Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere and Tanganyika African National Union Tonu. Role played by Tanganyika African National Union Tonu. Tonu was formed on 7 July 1954 in Dar es Salaam. It replaced Tanganyika African Association TAA. Dr. Julius Kambarage Nyerere assumed leadership of the party. The party made it clear that Tanganyika was an African country and therefore Africans had to have majority seats in government. The party opened up offices all over the Tanganyika which united the people. In 1954, a UN mission was sent to Tanganyika proposing a planned constitutional process. East African history, the rise of nationalism in East Africa. Nyerere and Tonu received a lot of sympathy from the UN that was against colonialism in Africa. Tony successfully mobilized Tanganyikans for self-rule in the next 2 years. In 1958, Tony won a landslide victory in the Legislative Council elections, largely due to its multiracial policy. The widespread use of Kiswahili as a national language also made it easy for the party to build a huge following. Tony defeated its only rival, the United Tanganyika Party (UTP), that was formed in 1956 by some members of the LECCO. After suffering a heavy defeat, UTP was disbanded unconditionally, and this increased Tony's power and credibility. Tony planned the composition of the LECCO to speed up the independence of Tanganyika. In the August 1960 elections, Tony swept the polls, winning 70 out of 71 African seats. During the voting, Tony promised Tanganyikans self-rule, safeguarding their interests and introduction of complete adult voting. On 1st May 1960, when Tanganyika was granted internal self-rule under Dr. Julius Nyerere, Nyerere became the first Prime Minister, and therefore Tony provided the first leaders of Tanganyika. Tony Africanized the civil service and introduced special training scheme to accelerate a changeover. On 9 December 1961, the Duke Edinburgh handed total independence to Tanganyika under Nyerere. In 1963, Tanganyika became a one-party state under Tony. East African history: the rise of nationalism in East Africa. While at Makara, he formed the Makara Boys of Tanganyika, an association of all Tanzanians at Makara. In 1945, he returned to Tanganyika to start a teaching career at St. Mary's Tabora Catholic Mission School. In 1949, he went for further studies at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland and attained a master's degree in history, economics and philosophy. While in Britain, he met various Pan-Africanists like Kwame Nkrumah and Jomo Kenyatta, who encouraged him to liberate his people. In 1952, he returned to Tanganyika and was elected secretary of Tanganyika African People's Welfare Association. He also became an active member of Tanganyika African Association (TAA). In 1953, he was elected president of the Tanganyika African Association, which he reorganized to form an effective organ in national politics. On 7 July 1954, Tony was formed at Dar es Salaam to replace TAA, and Nyerere was elected president of the new party. The party was broad in outlook, and Nyerere made it clear that Tony was opposed to tribalism and aimed at uniting all Tanganyikans for independence. Nyerere's non-racial tendencies soon endeared him to the governor, Sir Richard Turnbull. The two became good friends and always sat together to discuss government problems. In 1954, he presented the African case for self-rule to the United Nations visiting mission, and 1955 he visited the UN Trusteeship Committee, demanding independence for Tanganyika. Still in 1955, he was elected to the LECCO but resigned after 2 years, accusing it of not having a serious program as far as speeding up the independence of Tanganyika was concerned. And 1956 he went back to the UN Trusteeship. East African history: the rise of nationalism in East Africa. In his rule, he encouraged unity, non-racial politics, spirit of freedom and hard work. Uhuru no kazi. In the August 1960 elections, he steered Tony to another landslide victory, and it won 17 of all 71 seats reserved for Africans in the LECCO. On 1st May 1961, Tanganyika attained internal self-rule and Dr. Julius Nyerere became the first Prime Minister. On 9 December 1962, Tanganyika got total independence from the British, which the Duke of Edinburgh handed to Nyerere at Dar es Salaam Stadium. Nyerere became the first president of Tanzania. He retired from government service in 1985, and he died of leukemia on 14 October 1999 at St. Thomas Hospital in London. Why Tanganyika attained independence earlier than Uganda and Kenya? Tanganyika was gifted with able leadership of Julius Nyerere, who acted as a unifying factor. Nyerere has friendly relations with the governor, Sir Richard Turnbull, with whom they always discuss Tanganyika's problems. The presence of Kiswahili as a unifying language also speeded up independence because it fostered unity. Tanganyika was a mandated territory of the UN and was being looked after by the British, yet UN was against colonialism. Tanganyika lacked tribal and regional parties like it was the case in Uganda and Kenya, which also promoted unity. There were no settler demands in Tanganyika like it was in Kenya, where the white settlers wanted a say in government affairs. The close links that existed between UN and Tony also speeded up her independence campaigns. Nyerere was never imprisoned or his party banned like Kenyatta and UNC were banned from politics at one time. Tony lacked a strong rival, and therefore it had a strong following from all the people of Tanganyika. Naya came from the Zenaki tribe, which was one of the smallest tribes in Tanganyika. East African history, the rise of nationalism in East Africa. On 9th October 1962, Uganda attained total independence from the British. This was mainly due to the role played by Apollo Milton Obote. Dr. Apollo Milton Obote. He was born on 28 December 1924 at Akakura village in Lango, northern Uganda. He was born to a local village chief called Stanley Opta. He started his education at Lear Protestant School and then Tugulu High School and Busog College, Mweri. He then joined Maka University College in 1948 for an arts degree which he never completed. In 1949, Obote led a student strike in his second year at the university and he was expelled for political activism. After his expulsion, Obote was also denied a visa by the colonial government to study abroad. He later joined the British engineering and construction firm called Molam Construction, company based in Kenya. When the company transferred to Capita in Kenya, he followed it but left it for Standard Vacuum Oil Company. While in Kenya, he was inspired by members of Mau Mau like Jomo Kenyatta, General China, Wuruhu Aitote and Dedan Kimathi. He had studied with some of them at Makua. He stayed in Kenya until 1957 and when he returned to Uganda he was appointed chairman of the Uganda National Congress UNC Lango branch. In 1958 he was elected to the Leko representing Lango and he became one of the vocal members on the council. At the same time he befriended Ignatius Kangu Musisi, the leader of UNC, and Musisi appointed Obote as UNC representative in Mbale. Later Obote sacked Musisi for travelling to London without the consent of the party. As a result, UNC lost its popularity and Musisi was exiled in Kulu and later London. Obote then befriended William K. Nadiop, a member of the Leko who had formed the Uganda People's Union UPU. Nadiop always moved with and introduced Obote as a son of Busoga to the masses, but this East African history, the rise of nationalism in East Africa. In 1960, he was awarded an honorary degree of law of Long Island University in USA. On 9 March 1960, UPU merged with Obote's UNC wing to form the Uganda People's Congress UPC. Obote assumed leadership of the new party with John Kakonja as Secretary General. The party became more popular as more prominent people joined it, e.g. Jabari Bidandi Esoli, Olikawa Nakai Jr. and Danny Woodall and Abudia. In the 1961 elections, Obote's UPC lost to Ben Kiwanuka's Democratic Party DP. Kiwanuka became the leader of the Leko and Obote became leader of the opposition. In the Leko, Obote strongly demanded for an advance towards self-rule. On 1 March 1961, Uganda became self-governing. In the same year, Obote was among those who attended the London conference where he greatly supported Uganda's federal demands. He was so tactical that he even decided to marry a Uganda lady called Mirikawa, which made him a darling of the Vaganda. In April 1962, elections were organised and UPC got 37, DP got 24 and Kaboka KY got 21 votes. Obote decided to ally with KY to form a government and this was a victory for Obote. On 9 October 1962, Uganda got her independence with Obote as the Prime Minister. On 10 October 2005, Obote died in a Johannesburg hospital, Kenya. On 12 December 1963, Kenya finally attained independence from the British. Over 250,000 people gathered at the Uhuru Stadium to witness the occasion. It was steered to independence through the efforts of NZ Jomo Kenyatta and Kenya African National Union KONU, role played by KONU towards the independence of Kenya. KONU was formed in March 1960 by mainly African leaders in the Leko. James Gichuru was the party chairman/president, Ojinga Odinga as the vice president, and Tom Mbowe was the general secretary. The party largely drew its support from the Kikuyu and Luo tribes. It strongly opposed Kodji's federal system and campaigned for a strong central unity. East African history, the rise of nationalism in East Africa. The party sensitized the Kenyans about the need for independence. It worked as a mouthpiece for the Africans to voice out their problems. In 1960, it won a landslide victory in the elections but refused to form a government until Jomo Kenyatta was released. It organized boycotts, riots and demonstrations that helped speed up the independence of Kenya. It weakened tribal interests by being a mass political party, although some people accused it of having only Kikuyu and Luo in its ranks. KONU established ties with other political parties that were also fighting for independence like TONU in Tanganyika and CPP in Ghana. It condemned land grabbing and disrespect for African cultures. KONU won international sympathy, support and respect from all over the world. It was involved in the formation of Mau Mau to liberate Kenya. Using Mau Mau, it made Kenya ungovernable to the whites. Using the philosophy of Harambee, national unity was fostered. Konu groomed leaders who were instrumental in the fights for Kenya's independence, e.g. General China. Konu participated in the constitutional process that led to Kenya's independence. On 12 December 1963, Kenya successfully attained independence with Kenyatta as the president. The party therefore provided the first leaders of Kenya and formed the first government in Kenya. Mzee Jomo Kenyatta. He was born in 1893 in Senda near Nairobi. East African history: the rise of nationalism in East Africa. Unity. In 1929, he went to London as a representative of the Kikuyu Central Association and pleaded for the African loss of land to the colonial secretary. He returned to Kenya in 1930, and 1931 he left for England and studied anthropology at the London School of Economics. In 1945, he organised the Manchester Pan-African Congress with Kwame Nkrumah, George Hadmore and others. In July 1946, he returned to Kenya and he replaced James Gichuru as the leader of Kenya African Union KAU, a party that demanded for more African representation on the LegCo. He became an active member of Mau Mau and with General China, Dedan Kimathi and Tom Mboya as the leaders of the movement. During the same time, he also served as a principal of Githunguri Teacher Training College, but his stay was short-lived. He was sacked by the colonial government due to his growing popularity. Many KAU members were not impressed by Kenyatta's decision to support Mau Mau activities. In 1951, the party split between the moderates and extremists who didn't believe in the activities of Mau Mau. Kenyatta stayed with the moderates because of the high respect he had earned himself and also stayed in contact with Mau Mau fighters. In the same year, Kenyatta presented a memorandum to the Colonial Secretary Griffith, containing African demand for self-rule. In 1953, he was arrested on suspicion that he was the real power behind the Mau Mau guerrilla activities. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison with other leaders, e.g. General China and Dedan Kimathi. In 1960, Konu was formed by African leaders in the LegCo and they elected Kenyatta as president while still in prison. In 1961, he was released from prison and he assumed leadership of Konu. He was accused by some party members of being too town-centered, radical and making Konu a tribal grouping of only Kikuyu and Iwu. This led to the formation of a new party called KODU, Kenya African Democratic Union. Kenyatta tried to reconcile KODU and Konu, but his attempts failed. East African history: the rise of nationalism in East Africa. In January 1962, he was elected to the LegCo and during general elections, Konu won with an overwhelming majority. In February 1962, Kenyatta attended the Second Lancaster House Conference that was called to draw up a constitution for Kenya. In May 1963, elections were held and Konu won with 82 seats and its rival KODU got 41 seats. On 1 June 1963, Kenya attained self-rule and Kenyatta became Prime Minister. He chose all his ministers from all races and always stressed African unity. On 12 December 1963, Kenya achieved total independence at Uhuru Stadium. Prince Philip handed over the reins of power to Jomo Kenyatta, who therefore became the